The sun had barely crested the mesa when Sheriff Tom Bradley stepped out of his office, coffee mug in hand, expecting nothing more eventful than checking on the overnight prisoners. What he found instead made him nearly drop his cup onto the dusty wooden planks of the boardwalk. An elderly man sat slumped against the hitching post, his wrists bound with thick rope, a crude wooden sign hanging from his neck. The placard, written in bold black letters, read simply, "He never served." The man's weathered face bore the deep lines of someone who had seen too many harsh summers and bitter winters, his grey hair matted with sweat despite the cool morning air. Bradley set his coffee aside and approached cautiously. The bound man looked to be in his 60s, wearing clothes that had seen better days, but were clean and mended with care. His boots, though worn, were well maintained, and his posture, even in this humiliating position, suggested a man who had once carried himself with pride. "Mister, you all right?" Bradley asked, kneeling beside the stranger. The old man lifted his head slowly, revealing pale blue eyes that held more sadness than anger. "Name's Henry Cartwright, Sheriff. Been here since before dawn, I reckon." Bradley began working at the ropes. "Who did this to you, Mr. Cartwright?" "Don't rightly know," Henry replied, his voice hoarse. "Was walking back from the saloon last night when someone came up behind me. Next thing I knew, I was waking up here with this thing around my neck." As the sheriff freed him, a small crowd began to gather. Merchants opening their shops paused to stare, and early morning travelers stopped their horses to gawk at the spectacle. Word spread quickly in a town like Redemption Creek, where entertainment was scarce and gossip traveled faster than telegraph messages. "What's that sign supposed to mean?" asked Martha Henderson, the baker's wife, her flour-dusted apron a stark white against her dark dress. Henry struggled to his feet, rubbing his wrists where the rope had chafed. "I suppose someone thinks I'm lying about my service in the war." "The war?" Bradley picked up the placard, examining the crude lettering. "You mean the war between the states?" "Fought with the 4th Colorado Infantry," Henry said quietly. 3 years from 62 to 65. Lost a lot of good men. Doc Peterson, the town's physician, pushed through the small crowd, his medical bag in hand. "Let me take a look at those rope burns, Henry." As the doctor tended to Cartwright's injuries, Bradley noticed how the crowd's mood shifted. Some faces showed sympathy for the old man's plight, while others displayed skepticism. The war had ended 15 years ago, but its wounds still ran deep in many communities, especially in territories like Colorado, where loyalties had been divided. "Sheriff?" called out Jake Morrison, who ran the general store. "Maybe someone ought to ask why anybody would think he's lying about his service." Henry's jaw tightened, but he remained silent as Doc Peterson wrapped clean bandages around his wrists. "That's enough speculation for now," Bradley said firmly. "Mr. Cartwright, would you mind coming inside? I'd like to ask you some questions, and you probably could use some more coffee and a chance to clean up." As they walked toward the sheriff's office, Henry paused and looked back at the gathering crowd. "Sheriff, I've been in this town for near on 2 months now, working odd jobs, keeping to myself. Never caused any trouble." "I know that," Bradley replied. "Question is, why would someone want to humiliate you like this?" "That," Henry said with a weary sigh, "is what I've been trying to figure out since I woke up tied to that post." Inside the office, Bradley poured fresh coffee while Henry settled into a wooden chair across from the desk. Through the window, they could see townspeople still gathered outside, their conversations animated and their glances frequently directed toward the sheriff's office. "This kind of thing doesn't happen without reason," Bradley observed. "Someone wanted to make a public statement about you." Henry nodded slowly. "The question is whether they're trying to expose what they think is a lie, or if they're trying to start something bigger." The sheriff had been thinking the same thing. In his experience, public humiliation was often just the beginning of something worse. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Redemption Creek's main street as Sheriff Bradley made his rounds, but his mind remained fixed on Henry Cartwright's situation. The old man had spent the morning helping Doc Peterson organize medical supplies, earning a few coins in the doctor's respect. Yet whispers followed him wherever he went. Bradley's investigation had yielded little. No one claimed to have seen anything unusual the previous night, though the sheriff suspected at least half the town knew more than they were saying. Small towns had a way of protecting their secrets, even when those secrets festered like infected wounds. "Sheriff," called young Timothy Fletcher as he ran up the street, his face flushed with excitement. My pa wants to see you at the telegraph office. Says it's urgent. Bradley found Harold Fletcher hunched over a piece of paper, his expression grave. The telegraph operator looked up as the sheriff entered, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by concern. Tom, I've been sending inquiries about Henry Cartwright to various military records offices, Fletcher said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Got a response from Denver this afternoon. Bradley took the telegram and read it carefully. The message was brief but troubling. No record of Henry Cartwright, 4th Colorado Infantry. Unit roster complete. Stop. Suggest local verification. Stop. Could be a clerical error. Bradley mused, though doubt crept into his voice. Records from the war years aren't always complete. Maybe, Fletcher replied. But there's something else. Been getting reports that someone's been asking questions about Cartwright for weeks now. Stranger came through town about a month ago, asking at the saloon and the boarding house about any Civil War veterans. This new information changed everything. Someone had been investigating Henry before the humiliating incident at the hitching post. Bradley folded the telegram and slipped it into his vest pocket. Harold, I need you to keep this quiet for now. Can you send another inquiry, this time to the War Department in Washington? Ask for any Henry Cartwright who served in Colorado regiments. Meanwhile, across town at the Redemption Creek Saloon, Henry sat alone at a corner table, nursing a whiskey and trying to ignore the stares and whispered conversations around him. The saloon's atmosphere had grown thick with tension since his arrival. Suddenly, a tall man with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jaw approached Henry's table. The stranger wore a black coat despite the warm weather, and his boots showed the wear of someone who spent considerable time on horseback. Mind if I sit? The man asked, though he was already pulling out a chair. Henry gestured silently to the seat, his weathered hands steady despite the circumstances. Name's Marcus Webb, the stranger said, signaling the bartender for whiskey. Heard you had some trouble this morning. Word travels fast, Henry replied cautiously. Webb smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. In my experience, when a man claims military service he can't prove, trouble usually follows. He leaned forward slightly. See, I actually did serve with the 4th Colorado, joined up in '63 after the Battle of Glorieta Pass. Henry's expression remained neutral, but his grip on his whiskey glass tightened almost imperceptibly. Funny thing about military service, Webb continued, his voice low enough that other patrons couldn't hear. You remember the men you served with, their faces, their stories, their scars. I remember most every man in my company. Memory can be unreliable after 15 years, Henry said carefully. Perhaps, but some things stick with you. Webb rolled up his sleeve, revealing a jagged scar on his forearm. Got this at the Battle of Sand Creek, November of '64. Ugly business, that. He studied Henry's face intently. Where did you say you got wounded? Henry hadn't mentioned any wounds, and they both knew it. The conversation had become a careful dance of words, each man probing the other's knowledge and intentions. I was fortunate, Henry replied. Came through mostly unscathed. Webb nodded slowly, finishing his whiskey in one swallow. Lucky man indeed. Most of us weren't so fortunate. He stood, placing a silver dollar on the table. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Cartwright. I suspect we'll be seeing more of each other. As Webb walked away, Henry noticed that several other patrons watched the exchange with keen interest. One man seated near the bar quickly averted his gaze when Henry looked his direction. Another customer left the saloon immediately after Webb's departure, moving with purpose toward the sheriff's office. Henry realized that whatever game was being played, he was no longer just a victim of random humiliation. Someone was orchestrating events, and Marcus Webb might hold the key to understanding why. The old man finished his whiskey and prepared to leave, but the sensation of being watched never left him. As he stepped onto the boardwalk, he noticed a figure standing in the alley between the saloon and the mercantile, partially hidden in shadow but clearly observing his movements. Redemption Creek was proving to be far more complicated than Henry had anticipated when he'd arrived 2 months ago, seeking nothing more than a quiet place to spend his remaining years. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sheriff Bradley's office. A woman in her 30s, dressed in traveling clothes and carrying a worn leather satchel, knocked on the door just as Bradley was reviewing the latest telegrams about Henry Cartwright. Sheriff Bradley, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I believe you've been inquiring about a man named Henry Cartwright. Bradley invited her inside. noting the determination in her green eyes and the way she clutched her satchel as if it contained something precious. "I've traveled from Denver," Sarah continued, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I received word through friends in the telegraph office that someone was asking questions about Civil War records. You see, Sheriff, Henry Cartwright is my father." This revelation caught Bradley completely off guard. "Your father?" But he never mentioned having family. Sarah's expression grew pained. "We haven't spoken in over 10 years, not since I discovered the truth about his service record." She opened her satchel and withdrew a collection of letters tied with a blue ribbon. "These are letters he wrote to my mother during the war, Sheriff. Letters from someone who never left Colorado territory." Bradley examined the letters carefully. The postmarks were all from Denver and Colorado Springs, dated throughout the years Henry claimed to be serving with the 4th Colorado Infantry. The handwriting matched what Bradley had seen in the registration book at the boarding house. "He told everyone he was going off to fight," Sarah explained, her voice heavy with old disappointment. "But he spent those years working in the silver mines outside Denver, sending money home and writing letters as if he were on campaign. My mother never knew the truth. She died believing her husband was a war hero." "Why didn't he actually serve?" Bradley asked. "Fear, I suppose, or maybe he thought providing for his family was more important than fighting a war. I've never been entirely sure of his reasoning." Sarah wiped away a tear. "When I confronted him after Mother's funeral, he couldn't give me a straight answer. That's when he left Denver and started drifting." Meanwhile, across town, Henry was helping Martha Henderson repair the roof of her bakery when Marcus Webb approached, this time accompanied by 2 other men Bradley didn't recognize. "Afternoon." "Henry," Webb called out from the street below. "Wondered if we might have another conversation." Henry climbed down the ladder slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Martha retreated into her shop, sensing the tension in the air. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Henry asked, though his tone suggested he knew this wouldn't be a pleasant exchange. The larger of Webb's companions, a bearded man with calloused hands, stepped forward. "Name's Bill Sutter. I actually served with the 4th Colorado, unlike some folks around here." His voice carried a threatening edge. "Lost my brother at Sand Creek. He was 19 years old." Henry's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched slightly at his sides. Webb smiled that cold smile again. "Bill here has some strong feelings about men who profit from the sacrifices of real soldiers. Seems he's heard you've been collecting sympathy and free drinks by trading on service you never performed." "I never asked for sympathy," Henry replied quietly. "No," said the third man, who had remained silent until now. "But you accepted it readily enough. Name's Frank Morrison. Jake's my brother. He's been giving you credit at the store because he believed you were a veteran down on your luck." Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the town. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, including Sheriff Bradley, who had left Sarah Mitchell at his office after learning about the letters. "That's enough," Bradley announced, pushing through the crowd. "If you men have accusations to make, you can make them through proper channels." "What proper channels?" Sutter demanded. "The man's a fraud, Sheriff. He's been lying to this whole town about his service." "Is that true, Henry?" Bradley asked directly. The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Henry looked around at the faces surrounding him, some angry, some disappointed, some merely curious. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years was finally becoming too heavy. "It's true," he said simply. "I never served in the 4th Colorado Infantry. I never served anywhere." The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. Someone shouted, "Fraud!" Another voice called out, "What else has he been lying about?" Webb stepped closer to Henry. "The question now is what this town intends to do about it." Bradley moved between Webb and Henry. "What this town intends to do is handle this through the law, not through vigilante justice." "What law?" Webb challenged. "Is it illegal to lie about military service?" "It's illegal to obtain goods or services under false pretenses," Bradley replied. "And it's definitely illegal to take justice into your own hands." As the crowd began to disperse, Henry found himself face to face with Sarah Mitchell, who had followed the sheriff from his office. Father and daughter stared at each other for a long moment, 10 years of separation and disappointment hanging between them. "Hello, Papa," Sarah said softly. Henry's composure finally cracked. "Sarah, I didn't know you were in town. I came as soon as I heard someone was asking questions about your service record, the admission of his. Deception had changed everything in redemption. Creek, what had begun as a simple case of public humiliation, was now revealing deeper currents of deception, family pain, and community betrayal that would need to be addressed before the situation spiraled completely out of control. That evening, Sheriff Bradley sat across from Henry and Sarah in the small back room of his office, away from the prying eyes and curious ears that had followed them throughout the day. The reunion between father and daughter had been stilted, filled with the awkwardness of years spent apart and truths finally exposed. "I need to understand something." "Henry," Bradley said, pouring coffee for the three of them. "Why come to Redemption Creek? Why not stay in Denver or head somewhere nobody knew you?" Henry stared into his coffee cup, his weathered hands wrapped around the warm ceramic. "Been running from this lie for 15 years, Sheriff. Gets exhausting after a while. Thought maybe in a small town I could just be Henry Cartwright, the man who fixes roofs and helps with odd jobs. Didn't plan on anyone caring about my past." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "But you kept telling the same lie, Papa. Even here you told people you served." "Old habits," Henry replied with a bitter laugh. "You tell a story long enough, it starts to feel true. And people assumed, when they saw an old man my age, they just figured I'd served somewhere. Seemed easier to agree than to explain." Bradley had seen this before, though not with military service. Men carrying lies about their past, adding details over time until the fiction became their reality. "Someone's been investigating you for weeks, Henry. Any idea who or why?" "Could be someone from Denver," Sarah suggested. "Papa left debts behind when he disappeared. People who trusted him, people who might want to see him held accountable." "What kind of debts?" Bradley asked. Henry shifted uncomfortably. "After your mother died, Sarah, I made some poor choices, gambling mostly. Lost the house, lost what little savings we had. Some of the men I owed money to weren't the forgiving type." This revelation added another layer to the mystery. Someone with enough resources to track Henry across Colorado territory and orchestrate his public humiliation might well be a creditor seeking revenge rather than someone concerned with military honor. Knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Bradley opened it to find Doc Peterson, his expression grave. "Sheriff, I think you need to know something about Marcus Webb," the doctor said, glancing at Henry and Sarah. "Can we speak privately?" Bradley stepped outside with the doctor, closing the door behind them. "I've been thinking about Webb ever since that confrontation today," Peterson said quietly. "Something about him didn't sit right. So I sent a telegram to a friend of mine in Denver, a doctor who treated a lot of veterans after the war, asked him about Marcus Webb. And there was a Marcus Webb who served with the 4th Colorado, but he died at Sand Creek in 1864. My friend remembers treating his wounds before he passed." Peterson's voice dropped even lower. "Whoever that man is, Sheriff, he's not Marcus Webb." This news changed everything. Bradley realized they weren't dealing with veterans seeking justice against a fraud, but with someone using stolen identity for purposes still unclear. "Doc, I need you to keep this information to yourself for now, but stay alert. If this Webb character is willing to assume a dead man's identity, there's no telling what else he might do." When Bradley returned to the back room, he found Henry and Sarah in quiet conversation, the first real exchange they'd had in years. "Sarah, I know I can't undo the hurt I caused you," Henry was saying. "Your mother deserved better than a man who lived lies." "She loved you, Papa. Even knowing the truth wouldn't have changed that." Sarah's voice was soft but firm. "But I needed to understand why you chose deception over honesty." "Fear, mostly," Henry admitted. "Fear of not being man enough to fight. Fear of disappointing people who expected heroism. Seemed easier to be the man people wanted me to be, rather than the man I actually was." Bradley cleared his throat as he re-entered. "Henry, I need to ask you something, and I need the complete truth. These debts you mentioned in Denver, did any of them involve people who might be dangerous?" "There was one man," Henry said reluctantly. "Called himself the Colonel, though I doubt he ever held military rank. Ran gambling operations throughout the territory. I owed him considerable money when I left Denver. Enough that he might send someone after you? Enough that he made it clear leaving town wouldn't make the debt disappear." Sarah looked between her father and the sheriff. "You think this colonel sent someone to find Papa?" "It's possible," Bradley replied, though he kept his suspicions about Webb's true identity to himself for now. "The question is, what happens next?" Through the window, they could see lights flickering in various businesses along the main street. The town was still buzzing with news of Henry's admission, and Bradley knew that by morning, Everyone in Redemption Creek would have an opinion about what should be done with the man who had lied about his military service. "Sheriff," Henry said quietly, "I'm willing to make restitution to anyone I deceived. I never intended to harm this community." "That might not be enough," Bradley warned. "Some folks take military service very seriously, especially men who actually fought and lost friends in the war." The three sat in contemplative silence as darkness settled over Redemption Creek, each knowing that the morning would bring new challenges and that the truth, while finally revealed, had created as many problems as it had solved. Dawn brought unexpected visitors to Redemption Creek. Sheriff Bradley was awakened by urgent knocking on his door, and when he opened it, he found Harold Fletcher standing on his porch, still in his nightclothes and visibly shaken. "Sheriff, you need to come to the telegraph office immediately," Fletcher said, his voice trembling. "I've been receiving messages all night, and I think Henry Cartwright is in serious danger." At the telegraph office, Fletcher showed Bradley a series of messages that had arrived throughout the early morning hours. The first was addressed to Marcus Webb and simply read, "Proceed as planned. Colonel expects results by sunset." The second message was more ominous. "Debt collection authorized. Use necessary measures." "Harold, did you see who picked up that first message?" Bradley asked. "That's just it, Sheriff. Nobody's come for it yet, but I know Webb's been staying at the boarding house, so I expect he'll be by soon." Bradley realized that time was running short. If this Colonel character had sent Webb to collect Henry's debt through intimidation or worse, the situation was about to escalate beyond simple public humiliation. "I need you to send an urgent message to the Territorial Marshal in Denver," Bradley instructed. "Tell him we need assistance with a potential criminal matter involving debt collection and false identity." Meanwhile, Henry had spent a restless night at the boarding house, aware that his admission of deception had changed his status in the community from sympathetic figure to pariah. Sarah had taken a room down the hall, insisting she wouldn't abandon her father despite their complicated history. As Henry dressed for what he suspected might be his last day in Redemption Creek, he heard footsteps in the hallway, followed by a firm knock on his door. "Mr. Cartwright," came Webb's voice from the other side. "We need to have that conversation now." Henry opened the door to find Webb flanked by the same two men from the previous day's confrontation. This time, however, their intentions seemed more serious than public shaming. "The Colonel sends his regards," Webb said, pushing past Henry into the small room. "He's been very patient about your outstanding debt, but patience has its limits." "I told you I'd make restitution to the town for my deception," Henry replied, backing toward the window. "That doesn't include old gambling debts." Bill Sutter laughed harshly. "You think this is about what you owe the storekeepers here? This is about $1,500 plus interest that you've owed the Colonel for over 10 years. The amount was staggering. Henry had known he owed money when he left Denver, but he hadn't realized the debt had grown so substantially over time. "I don't have that kind of money," Henry said honestly. "No," Webb agreed. "But you have something else the Colonel values, information." This confused Henry. "What information?" Frank Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "You spent 3 years working in the silver mines outside Denver during the war. The Colonel believes you might have learned things about mining claims, about who struck silver and who didn't." Suddenly, Henry understood. During his time in the mines, he had indeed learned about several rich veins that hadn't been properly filed or claimed, information that would be valuable to someone with the resources to exploit it. "You want me to help you steal mining claims," Henry said. "We prefer to think of it as collecting what's owed," Webb replied, "plus interest." Before Henry could respond, they heard Sarah's voice in the hallway, talking to other guests about breakfast arrangements. Webb gestured for silence, but Henry realized this might be his only chance to alert someone to his situation. "Sarah," he called out loudly, "could you ask Sheriff Bradley to meet me at the restaurant? I have something important to tell him." Webb's face darkened with anger. "That was a mistake, old man." The sound of footsteps running down the hall indicated that Sarah had understood something was wrong. Within minutes, they could hear voices gathering outside the boarding house. "Seems like your daughter inherited your talent for complicating simple situations," Webb observed. "No matter. We'll handle this publicly if necessary." Through the window, Henry could see Sheriff Bradley approaching with several armed townspeople, including Doc Peterson and Jake Morrison. The confrontation Henry had been dreading was about to unfold in full view of the entire community. Webb checked his pocket watch. Colonel expected this resolved by sunset, but it appears we'll need to accelerate our timeline. He looked at Henry with cold calculation. You're going to walk downstairs with us, nice and calm, and tell those people you've decided to leave town to make amends for your deception. Then you're coming with us to Denver. And if I refuse, then this town will learn what happens to communities that harbor men who default on their obligations to the Colonel. Henry realized that his years of deception had not only caught up with him personally, but were now threatening the innocent people of Redemption Creek. The weight of his choices pressed down on him as he prepared to face whatever consequences awaited. Outside, the final confrontation was about to begin, and Henry knew that this time he couldn't run from the truth or its implications. The standoff outside the Redemption Creek boarding house drew nearly every resident of the town. Sheriff Bradley positioned himself strategically between the building and the growing crowd, his hand resting on his gun but not yet drawn. Sarah stood with Doc Peterson, her face pale with worry for her father's safety. "Webb," Bradley called out, "I know who you really are, and I know why you're here. This ends now." A window on the second floor opened, and Webb appeared with his gun pressed against Henry's back. "Sheriff, I suggest you and these good people disperse. This is a private business matter between Mr. Cartwright and his creditors." "Private business doesn't involve impersonating a dead war hero," Bradley replied loudly, ensuring the crowd could hear. "Marcus Webb died at Sand Creek in 1864. Whoever you are, you've been using a dead man's name and reputation." This revelation sent murmurs through the crowd. Several of the men who had been sympathetic to Webb's earlier claims about Henry's deception now looked uncertain. Bill Sutter appeared at another window, his rifle aimed at the sheriff. "Don't matter what name he uses, the debt's real, and it's going to be paid." From inside the boarding house, Henry's voice carried clearly. "Sheriff, they want information about silver claims from the Denver mines. They're claim jumpers working for someone they call the Colonel." "Henry Cartwright," Webb shouted, pressing the gun harder against the old man's back. "You just signed your own death warrant." But Henry had reached a decision that 15 years of running and hiding had brought him to. "Sarah," he called to his daughter, "I want you to know that the biggest mistake I ever made wasn't lying about the war. It was letting that lie cost me 10 years with you." "Papa, don't do anything foolish," Sarah cried out. Henry turned suddenly, grabbing Webb's gun hand and pushing it away from his body. The weapon discharged into the air, and the two men crashed through the boarding house window onto the roof of the general store below. The fall knocked Webb unconscious, but Henry, despite his age, managed to roll away from the impact. Sheriff Bradley and several townsmen rushed to secure both Sutter and Morrison, who had been caught off guard by Henry's desperate action. Doc Peterson climbed onto the roof to tend to both men's injuries while Bradley handcuffed the unconscious Webb. "Henry, that was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've seen in 20 years of law enforcement." "Maybe both," Henry replied, wincing as the doctor examined a gash on his forehead. "But I'm tired of running from my mistakes." As Webb regained consciousness, Bradley questioned him about his real identity and his connection to the Colonel. Under pressure and facing serious charges, the man admitted to being Thomas Kellerman, a former associate of the Denver crime boss who had been sent to collect Henry's debt and gather information about unclaimed silver deposits. "The Colonel's been expanding his operations," Kellerman explained, hope of a reduced sentence loosening his tongue. He figured an old mining worker like Cartwright might know about overlooked claims that could be worth a fortune. Over the following hours, as territorial marshals arrived from Denver and took Kellerman and his associates into custody, the truth about Henry's past became fully clear to the people of Redemption Creek. That evening, as the town began to return to normal, Henry found himself once again in Sheriff Bradley's office, but this time as a free man whose honesty had helped expose a larger criminal. "Operation, the territorial marshal says the information you provided about the Colonel's activities will be valuable in bringing down his entire organization," Bradley reported. "They're offering you protection if you're willing to testify." Henry nodded. "I'll do whatever's necessary. I owe this community that much for the deception I've practiced." Sarah, who had remained by her father's side throughout the ordeal, spoke up. "Papa, the people here have seen who you really are when it mattered most. That counts for something." Jake Morrison knocked on the office door and entered with several other townspeople, including Martha Henderson and Doc Peterson. Henry braced himself for their judgment, expecting anger or demands that he leave town. Instead, Jake extended his hand. "Henry, we've been talking, And we want you to know something. Maybe you didn't serve in the 4th Colorado Infantry, but you served this community today when it counted. That makes you a different kind of veteran in our book." Martha nodded in agreement. "We're not perfect people here in Redemption Creek, Henry. We've all made mistakes and told stories we wish we could take back. What matters is how a person acts when the truth comes out." Doc Peterson smiled. "Besides, we could use someone with your carpentry skills on a permanent basis. The church roof needs work, and winter's coming." As the townspeople filed out, offering words of support and tentative friendship, Henry found himself overwhelmed by their forgiveness. For the first time in 15 years, he felt the weight of deception lifting from his shoulders. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I know I can't undo the years we lost, but if you'll have me, I'd like to try being the father I should have been all along." Sarah embraced him, tears streaming down her face. "We both have things to forgive, Papa, but we have time now." Sheriff Bradley watched the reunion with satisfaction, knowing that sometimes justice came not from punishment, but from the courage to face the truth and the community's willingness to offer redemption to those who earned it. Outside, the sun set over Redemption Creek, and for the first time in many years, Henry Cartwright looked forward to seeing it rise again.